Good morning, everyone. On behalf of our CEO and President, Ambassador Mark Green, I would like to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars here in Washington, D.C. My name is Beatriz Garcia-Nice. I'm the project lead for the Wilson Center's Gender-Based Violence Project, part of the Latin American program. I'd like to welcome our partners for this event, the George W. Bush Center. This is not the first time that we've worked with the Bush Center this year, and it certainly won't be the last, I hope. Last year, the Bush Center collaborated in the Wilson Center's publication, Pathways to Justice, Gender-Based Violence and the Rule of Law. The Bush Center's work on gender in Central America highlights the need for a more comprehensive approach to gender-based violence and the effect it has on migration from the Northern Triangle. We are thrilled to partner. Today, we will hear from social leaders and international actors on the challenges women face, but most importantly, we'll learn about possible solutions and adequate responses to this challenge. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Matthew Rooney, Director of Outreach and Strategic Partnerships from the George W. Bush Center, for introductory remarks. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Beatriz. Good morning, everyone in the room and online. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. As Beatriz said, my name is Matthew Rooney. I'm the Director of Outreach and Strategic Partnerships at the George W. Bush Institute. As many of you, I hope, know, the George W. Bush Institute is a think and do tank based in Dallas, Texas, founded by President and Mrs. George W. Bush upon their departure from the White House in 2009. Our policy agenda follows up on the areas of public life that were most compelling and most interesting to President and Mrs. Bush. So we have programs on the transition from military to civilian life. We have programs on education reform. We have programs on empowerment of women around the world, particularly in Middle East, North Africa, and Afghanistan. We have a public health program that follows up on PEPFAR. And we have our program, the Economic Growth Program, which follows up on President Bush's commitment to open markets and free trade, exemplified among many other things by the Central America Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, which was one of the Bush administration's signal accomplishments and one of the reasons why the Bush Institute has focused so extensively on Central America. It's a pleasure to thank Beatriz, her colleagues Duncan, our friends in the tech support area here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. As Beatriz said, it's a great partnership that has been a pleasure to be a part of, which extends well beyond the gender violence space. It includes our work together on North America, on workforce development issues, and on Central America. So today's meeting, today's session arises from our work on Central America, which we call the Central America Prosperity Project. In its first iteration, what we informally call Central America Prosperity Project 1.0, our group focused on economic issues, economic growth issues, why the economies of those societies, particularly in the northern part of Central America, don't thrive and produce more job opportunities. And we settled on digital services as a very powerful practical tool for limiting corruption, curtailing corruption, and pushing back on informality, which the group agreed were two of the core challenges standing in the way of stronger economic growth in Central America. As time went on, we came to focus, as many people came to focus, on a broader question of why so many people seek to leave their homes in Central America and find lives elsewhere, particularly in the United States. And so with CAP 2.0, we want to have a holistic, interdisciplinary look at what are called the root causes, why people are motivated to leave their homes in Central America. And so today's event, which focuses on gender-based violence, which I think is an increasingly widely understood and appreciated driver of migration out of the region, is an important step along the way for us. So we're very grateful to everyone who's tuned in online, for everyone who's here in the room, for your attention this morning, and look forward to a very productive and I think rich conversation. The group has many, many powerful insights and brings a wide variety of perspectives to all of these problems. And I think everyone will find the conversation very useful. And so with that, let me turn the floor to my colleague, Jenny Villatoro, who's the day-to-day manager of our CAP program, and will take us through the rest of at least the first part of the morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. And thank you again to the Wilson Center for so graciously hosting us. When it comes to migration from Northern Central America, specifically El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the status of women and girls is so often left out of the root causes conversation. Whether we're responding to new migrant caravans that are forming or debates around Title 42, we see the conversation center around economic incentives, corruption, informality, general citizen security issues. And while these are critical issues that the region needs to address, they're not unrelated to violence against women. And we're simply not going to see the kind of improvements that we want to in these areas when the status of women and girls is relegated to a single bullet point at the end of a press release or completely left out of any strategies to address these issues. We know that societies that protect women, that offer more equitable access to opportunities and access to justice are safer, more prosperous, and more democratic. And if those are things that we want to see in the region, then the status of women and girls, including violence against them, needs to be addressed. Violence against women and girls, or gender-based violence, is a barrier to economic growth, and as stated earlier today, a driver of outmigration. So I'm very grateful for our panelists of experts here that will talk to us a little bit more about that second point. Hannah, would you like to start us off with a brief introduction?
Yeah, so thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. My name is Hannah Sklar. I have been working in Guatemala since 2010. I am the executive director at a nonprofit that works with the community surrounding the Guatemala City garbage dump. Our work primarily focuses on women and their families. We approach gender-based violence and economic development from four main areas. We work in income generating, job inclusion, emotional support, and adult education. So I am really excited, and I'm excited that gender-based violence is part of this conversation, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Juan Miguel?
Good morning, all. My name is Juan Miguel Rivera. I'm the Vice President of Programs at the International Justice Mission in Central America. Our approach to gender-based violence is combating violence by ending impunity. So we work with communities to enhance access to justice for victims and survivors of violence, but we also work with governments to ensure that they are responding adequately to the problem. So we're not, just like you said, we're not gonna thrive economically or politically if more than half of the population is not protected from violence.
Thank you. Carlos, adelante.
Bueno, soy Carlos Hernández, soy el director de la Asociación para una Sociedad Más Justa en Honduras. La SJ trabaja hace ya 23 años en el país en diferentes áreas, especialmente el tema de seguridad, justicia, salud, educación. Y parte de nuestra estrategia es un encuentro entre un trabajo que hacemos a nivel local con las comunidades, pero también contribuyendo a diseñar políticas públicas que permitan a los gobiernos, a los tomadores de decisiones, tener evidencia para poder legislar o para poder realizar acciones en beneficio de los más pobres de nuestro país.
Gracias. Carlos, cuéntanos un poquito sobre la magnitud de la violencia de género que hay en Centroamérica.
Bueno, yo creo que primero es importante recordar un poco la historia de Honduras. Honduras llegó a convertirse en el país más violento del mundo en el 2012. Y si lo vemos en un contexto más amplio, no podemos desconocer que nuestra región es una de las regiones más violentas en el mundo, lamentablemente. A pesar de distintos esfuerzos que se han venido realizando a lo largo de los últimos años, el problema persiste, y particularmente en mi país, en Honduras, si bien es cierto, se logró con un esfuerzo y con una inversión bastante considerable y una participación activa de la sociedad civil, de la comunidad internacional, reducir de 86 homicidios por 100,000 a bajarlos a 40, que todavía obviamente es la tasa altísima, aunque tenemos que decir que lo celebrábamos de tener un descenso tan significativo. Al final las mujeres y distintos estudios que se han realizado demuestran que al final las mujeres son uno de los grupos más afectados, producto de la violencia. Estudios nos revelan que, por ejemplo, la gente que está siendo retornado, por lo menos 2 veces más a menudo, las mujeres expresan que la razón por la cual tuvieron que abandonar el país es producto de la violencia. Las mujeres que en una sociedad machista, en una sociedad patriarcal, no siempre tienen las oportunidades para poder tener acceso a los sistemas de justicia, a los sistemas de protección local, al final se ven afectadas de manera directa y eso provoca que tengan que buscar opciones de sobrevivencia, porque al final se trata de sobrevivir. Y una de las maneras de sobrevivir es, bueno, tratar de, en primera instancia, buscar opciones internas en el país. Entonces, la migración interna que en los últimos años ha crecido, pero en última instancia también salir de Honduras y en este caso Estados Unidos, pero también España, que también en los últimos años se convirtió por las condiciones un poco más favorables, se convirtió en un espacio para poder emigrar y poder salir del país y tratar de huir de la pobreza, pero huir también de esa violencia sistémica que a través de los años, de los siglos, las mujeres han sido víctimas.
Gracias. Y es imposible pensar que este nivel de violencia, de este nivel de inestabilidad, no va a afectar a las oportunidades económicas. Hannah, speak to us a little bit about how this violence affects economic opportunity and economic development.
Yeah, so I think first when we talk about gender-based violence, a lot of times our mind immediately goes to physical violence and sexual violence. And I think when we're talking about barriers to economic development, we need to also talk about the more subtle forms of violence, including name-calling, jealousy, decisions which are being made in the home, name-calling. There was a really interesting survey done a few years ago that talked about when men wanted women to ask permission and in what circumstances women needed to ask men for permission. And 82% of men said that women needed to ask permission to leave their homes. 77% of men said that women needed to ask permission to work or to study. And 60% of men required for women to ask for permission to use contraceptives. And I think that again, these more subtle forms of violence are imperative in the conversation. In Creamos, we provide non-threatening services, which are just a way for women to get in the door. We provide Zumba class, and a lot of times when we were starting to do it, a woman came up to me and she said, listen, I can't come anymore. And it was because her husband was mad because he said, why are you trying to lose weight and cheat on me? So these are really subtle forms of violence that affect women in every stage of life. I also think it's important to understand the women's work context in Guatemala. So 70% of individuals in Guatemala work in the informal sector. Out of those 70%, 51% of those are women. What does this mean? It means that women have poor working conditions. Whether this means that they're working for very long hours, their pay isn't regulated by any type of government standard. It also means that women are receiving no healthcare benefits or no governmental benefits. Just as an example, 7% of women work as household cleaners. Just a side note, 80% of those women are indigenous. So women are working extremely long hours without any type of regulation, which happens in so many different sectors. We see it in our community with women working in the garbage dump, women working in sex work and drug dealing. So I think this is just one of the many examples of when we say, why are women working in these conditions? A lot of times there's not a lot of choices. So if women are given permission to work, they face so many more barriers on a macro, meso, and micro scale. A lot of times when women work, husbands will play, or partners will play with different resources. So let's say a woman has a job, maybe a husband won't give her money for transportation, or maybe they'll play with the childcare that she secured in order to work. We see a lot of, intermarital rape, which results in women being pregnant over and over again, which means that they can't participate in the workforce. And I think that there's just, from a systemic level, I work in the community that surrounds the garbage dump, which is known as a red zone, which means that there's high crime rate. In Guatemala, when you're applying for a job, you hand in your resume and you have to have your address on it. The second that companies see that a woman is from Zone 3 or Zone 7, which is, again, a red zone, there's many others, I'm sure, across all Central America, they take your resume and they'll just throw it away because they associate individuals with extortion or gang violence. So there's many barriers which we're not mentioning, and we could go on for this for hours, but I think that it's just important, again, to think about all the different micro, meso, and macro levels and the challenges that women are faced in this sector.
Thank you, Hannah. I think it's really important to remember, when we say gender-based violence, that's such a wonky term sometimes. It's not necessarily in everybody's everyday use. And like you said, that comes with kind of preconceived notions or preconceived bias. And so I'm so grateful that you pointed out some of these more subtle forms, or some of these forms of violence and control that affect economic development that we may not think of or may not be top of mind when we say gender-based violence or violence against women and girls. Juan Miguel, you've done a lot of work, and IJM has done a lot of work in El Salvador. And one statistic that always kind of knocks me off my feet when I hear about it is that El Salvador did a national survey, and 67% of women responded that they had been a victim of violence, but only 6% had reported it to authorities. And so in this context of control and having to ask for permission, and we see in the data a lack of trust, right? That kind of reflects a lack of trust in the justice system to not report it. How are the justice systems in these countries responding?
Well, the first thing I would say is this is not an all or nothing problem. We tend to believe like either justice systems are doing everything well or they are doing nothing. And the reality is much more complex than this. Just yesterday we were discussing the very significant progress in some cases of gender-based violence in the region but still recognizing that we need to do a lot of things, still need to do a lot of things. But the reason why I'm saying, or what I'm referring to this progress is because in the midst of all these conversations about the status of democracy in Central America or the causes of migration and all these different things, we tend to be a little pessimistic about what are the things that we can do. And the reality is there are still viable partnerships in Central America. And one of those critical and viable partnerships is working with governments to improve their response to gender-based violence. And that said, like I mentioned before, there are things that need to be done. We believe one of those is actually strengthen the capacity of the public justice system so that they can investigate, prosecute, and administer justice in a fair, transparent, and efficient manner. This is very important, and let me give you just a short example about this. We conducted a performance study a couple years ago in El Salvador that showed that in cases of sexual assault, less than 1% of the cases actually complied with judicial deadlines.
Wow.
Less than 1%. What it means is that more than 99% of the cases have several delays across the process. For a victim, a survivor of violence, this is a very significant barrier to justice. The system needs to improve the quality of the criminal investigation. The prosecution needs to adopt gender-responsive, trauma-informed care practices, but also needs to increase the overall efficiency. And the only way to do this is working with governments because they are responsible for this. The other thing that we believe is fundamental here is connecting communities and building more responsive communities. we tend to see gender-based violence as a problem that is exclusively the responsibility of the state because of the reasons I mentioned. They're responsible for protecting their citizens and executing justice. But communities do have a big role to play here, increasing or enhancing access to justice, providing support, building resilient communities. So we believe that if we have these two elements, well-connected, resilient, responsive communities, and responsive governments that are efficient, fair, and transparent, we can actually combat the horrific numbers of impunity that Carlos was mentioning before. So just let me refer back to what I was saying, but we do need to do this together. While governments are responsible for this, while citizens are responsible for demanding governments to take actions, and actors like us provide technical assistance, this is such a complex problem that remaining engaged and involved is critical. And just because we're also talking to a US-based audience, for example, let me give you an example of this. In Guatemala or El Salvador, it was through US government cooperation that governments were able to build specialized justice systems for victims of gender-based violence. And those systems are in place and are helping. They're not perfect. We need to do more. But it was that combination of technical cooperation and other governments engaged, other actors engaged, government willingness, civil society organizations engagement that allowed for these very fundamental changes.
Yes, and we're so grateful for the work that IJM does with these partnerships, and also organizations like Creamos and ASJ, who are part of that community response to these issues. So that's a good point. I'm going to ask you a tough question now. So we've talked a little bit about the scale and the level of violence and the lack of access to justice, where there are opportunities to make the justice systems better, to strengthen systems in Central America. But why should the U.S. care?
Well, I think we already mentioned this a couple times. Violence will continue driving migration. That's a reality. Gender-based violence is posing a significant barrier to economic development, prosperity, the ability to contribute to the household income, for example. Gender-based violence does have a connection with other forms of violence that are more obvious in terms of creating displacements and migration, such as gang-related violence, for example. There are many interconnections and interdependencies with many other driving causes of migration. So the problem of irregular migration is not going to be solved if the root causes are not addressed. And gender-based violence is one of these root causes. The other thing is let's think about the people who might want to return. A couple years ago, the Inter-American Development Bank published this study, Tras los Pasos de los Migrantes. And one of the things that was just really interesting to me was the number of people who were willing to come back, the number of potential returnees.
Well, if you didn't want to leave in the first place, right, you might have that esperanza that things will get better and improve, and you could go home.
Exactly, absolutely. And when you look at the numbers, it's like in the case of Guatemalans, for example, only 1 in 4 actually is thinking about, and this is regular and irregular migrants, only 1 in 4 is actually thinking of making the U.S. their permanent residency. And some of them may actually be legal residents already. But the other 3 are actually thinking on coming back. When you talk to these people, when you talk to people who came back or people who are thinking on coming back, they will tell you that they need access to a secure income, kind of the prosperity part of this, the economic development, but they also need security. They don't want one or the other. They want both. They want to be able to assure that there is certain quality of life for them and their children, but they also want to feel protected and safe because they already know what it is to be protected and safe. Mm-hmm. So having a law enforcement that works, having a public protection system that works, having services that are accessible for women at risk and survivors of violence is just essential, not only to stop migration, but also to bring people back, the people who wants to come back. If it is not safe, I'm not coming back. So why should the U.S. care? Because it is a problem that can stop. Addressing the root causes is just essential to stop the issue.
Humor me. I have one more for you, and then we'll ask our other panelists. But we have violence against women here.
Yeah, but I think the main difference is the rule of law, the law enforcement capacity, the availability of protection services. That's a very important difference. There's gender-based violence everywhere in the world. I think the most significant difference is if you're a victim or survivor, what kind of services and protection and can you access where you are? The reality is law enforcement in most of the communities in the two countries is not easily available for anyone. So you might be a woman in need of urgent help. You're going to call the police. They may or may not arrive, depending on a number of factors. You're going to go through the public justice system. You may get the protection you need, or you may not. So that's why we work so much in efficiency and effectiveness of the public justice system, because the impunity rates are incredibly high, and the protection services are just lacking everywhere. Again, I do want to emphasize there's progress. There are viable partnerships there, but there are still significant barriers.
Yeah, the situation hasn't yet improved, though, if we're still looking at only 1% access to justice. Carlos, me gustaría hacer la misma pregunta. ¿Por qué le debería importar a los Estados Unidos esta violencia de género en la región?
Normalmente podemos responder de manera romántica, a esa pregunta. Y uno podría decir, hemos mantenido una relación histórica de conexión entre Estados Unidos y Honduras, o Centroamérica. Centroamérica fue el foco de inversión para muchas de estas muchas empresas norteamericanas. Somos los vecinos, que estamos muy cerca, entonces obviamente como vecinos debería de interesarnos, pero yo creo que hay otra realidad que por lo menos no lo hemos hablado acá y es un tema que está muy vinculado con esto de la violencia, y es el tema de narcotráfico, es el tema de drogas. O sea, hay una realidad, y es que nuestra región es el paso obligado de la droga que está entrando a Estados Unidos, de los mayores productores, que en este caso es el sur. Y me parece que eso hay que decirlo, el sur que está produciendo en cantidades bastante grandes, y el norte que está consumiendo también de manera muy fuerte. Y en ese tránsito, pues estamos nosotros. Y yo sé que por muchas ocasiones se ha dicho esto, pero al final ese tránsito genera dolor, genera muerte, genera pobreza, genera miseria, genera desesperanza. Y menciono esto porque estudios recientes están hablando de cómo todo este flujo de tráfico ilegal que ha cooptado los estados, que ha vulnerado el Estado de Derecho, Honduras es un ejemplo claro sobre esto, al final ha provocado que la ciudadanía no vea un futuro claro. Y entonces y en este momento nos estamos enfrentando con gente que tiene un empleo, pero de repente, al no ver un futuro claro, están pensando también salir del país. Entonces me parece... No
tienen esperanza.
No tienen esperanza, exacto. Entonces esa falta de esperanza es la que está provocando. Así es que me parece a mí que, aparte de la relación y la historia tradicional que tenemos, hay factores profundos, como el que ya mencionaba del tema del narcotráfico, que está provocando y está empujando a la gente a salir. Es una de las razones que Estados Unidos debe de prestar muchísima atención. Somos del criterio que hay que revisar constantemente toda esa política que hay para asegurar la efectividad, porque al final lo que queremos es la efectividad, cómo lograr que el hondureño o que el centroamericano se quede, porque al final nadie quiere salir de su tierra, o sea, salen y están saliendo de manera obligados. Entonces, cómo crear condiciones para que en nuestros países pueda la gente sobrevivir, pueda tener un empleo digno, pueda tener educación digna, pueda tener un sistema de salud que al final le genere un espacio de esperanza, de oportunidades que impida y que no esté provocando el deseo de salir de sus países.
Gracias. Y ese tema, esa palabra de vecinos, me recuerda a un dicho, y la voy a decir en inglés para no decirlo mal. Es que we hear this term neighbors, right? We're neighbors. And I've heard it put before that we're not really neighbors, we're family. Because you can move away from a neighbor, right? But we can't move away from where we are. And so sometimes there's challenges with family relationships, but they're important and they're critical. And they are, they're valuable and they're worth the work to make them function well. So that was really interesting. Hannah, bring us home. Why should the U.S. care?
So, as someone that is from the U.S., I consider myself very lucky to have called Guatemala my home for 10 years. And I think that I just want to bring the lens of someone, again, who's from the States. When we're talking about gender-based violence, I think a lot of times we just paint sometimes Central America in red. And I think we just need to remember that. And I can speak mostly to Guatemala, and I know that all of Central America is like this. They're beautiful countries, and they're the type of places where you're walking down the street and you do not fail to be greeted by someone. It's the type of place where family time is sacred. It's the type of place where your car breaks down in the middle of the street and the whole entire town comes and supports. So I think that we need to remember that people have strong roots to their home country. And I think that we also need to remember that Guatemala has a really volatile past. And that past has also contributed to extreme poverty, to hegemonic masculinity, and to economic exclusion. So what happens there, a lot of times when women are faced with violence, it's not just something small, their lives are in danger. In 2021, 254 women were murdered between January and May. This year, between January and May, that number is up 48%. So it's not something to just brush by lightly. When women have to experience violence, they need to figure out it's not only them, it's also their children. So making the decision to leave their home and to leave that beautiful country and the roots, it is a really hard decision. And I work with women, and it's not, okay, let me just go right to the States. They try to move to different parts of the city. They try to move to different parts of the country. They'll find family members 8 hours away, and they'll ride on a motorcycle to get to them. But a lot of times there's just no option. So I think what I would try to have, or I hope people remember, is all of these root causes that we've talked about today, that it is not an easy decision to leave, and a lot of time it's a matter of life and death for women and their children.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is that this isn't migration in the sense that we think of sometimes in the United States, where maybe somebody's going to move to a different town for a better job. This is really displacement that is happening as a result of these high levels of violence, high levels of impunity, a really completely inadequate response from the justice system that is creating a lack of access to justice. And this migration, this displacement, obviously once it's kind of exhausted all of its options internally, happens externally, comes up through Mexico, and eventually to the United States. And our second panel is going to talk about the role of regional stakeholders in that migration, the role of regional stakeholders in advancing solutions and in strengthening these justice systems. Thank you again to our expert panel. I really appreciate your time this morning and your expertise and your passion and heart for Central America. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for that fantastic introduction. We are absolutely honored to be here. My name is Natalie Ganella-Platts. I'm the Director of Women's Advancement at the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas, Texas. And as Jenny mentioned, we're going to transition the conversation a little bit to pull up a bit from what is happening at the country level and to look at how the implications of gender-based violence, instability, economic stagnation across the Northern Triangle not only has an impact in terms of the regional and international neighbors and stakeholders within the Western Hemisphere, but also how these stakeholders have a responsibility in terms of advancing solutions and strengthening justice systems. I'm delighted to be joined by two incredible practitioners and experts. I have Maria Caridad Areja, who is Chief of the Gender and Diversity Division at the Inter-American Development Bank, where she leads efforts to improve access to quality services, economic opportunities, and strengthening the voice and representation of diverse communities across the region. This includes an emphasis on diversity and inclusion, and the division fulfills its mission through direct and indirect investment, technical assistance, and analytical work and training. I'm also delighted to welcome Jennifer Podkul, who is an international human rights lawyer and expert on child migration in the United States. She currently serves as the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for Kids in Need of Defense. KIND is devoted to the protection of unaccompanied and separated children and envisions a world in which every unaccompanied child on the move has access to legal counsel and has their rights and well-being protected as they migrate alone in search of safety. Thank you both for being here today. Just to elaborate a bit on some of the points that were raised during the last panel, for migrants and especially women and children who choose to make the arduous journey to the U.S. southern border, for many, asylum really is the only legal means that migrants who qualify have of entering the United States. And for so many of them, it is the only pathway they have in terms of seeking safety. And they're willing to undertake an incredibly risky journey with the high likelihood of re-victimization, including rape and other forms of exploitation, because it's better than the day-to-day of what they experience back home. And that is why the role of rights, systems, access to services is not just important and exclusive within the borders of the Northern Triangle, but is really integral in terms of other stakeholders in the region, including Mexico and the United States. So we're really going to drill down not just on the challenges, but also the opportunities for solutions that exist. So Jennifer, I want to start with you. Your work with KIND really focuses on minors and unaccompanied children. And obviously, we've talked about the challenges that exist within the Northern Triangle, but I was wondering if you could elaborate specifically on, what are the primary reasons that minors themselves are choosing to leave?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for these good questions and this conversation. So KIND serves children on the move kind of at every stage of their experience, right? We're looking at why kids are leaving in the first place. Why is it they feel like they can't stay home? What happens to them to the journey? What happens when they arrive at an international border? And then what does the system look like that's going to decide whether or not that child stays in a different place, if that's really in their best interest, or if it's safe for them and it's appropriate for them to go back to their country of origin. So KIND has worked with thousands of children over the years. And, what the kids say to us is that, they wanted to stay home, right? They wanted to be in their communities, they wanted to be with their families, and they just couldn't, right? It wasn't safe for them to do so. They had to leave because, they weren't safe. So that could be they weren't safe in the home, they weren't safe in the community. Them being a young person, right, may have created danger for their family. Some of them are doing it and having to leave their home to protect their families. And so, we hear these tragic stories, and, our goal and our ultimate mission is to try to figure out what can we do to make sure that a child never feels like they have to leave their home, right? That's the ultimate goal. In the meantime, though, there are kids that do need to leave, and what can we be doing right now to make sure that we're addressing their needs and creating systems that are really going to create kind of a seamless protection system for them at every stage of the journey.
And Caridad, Jennifer has talked a bit about sort of the individual choice and the way in which GBV impacts the individual and their movement often north. But I was curious, from your position with the IDB, if you could elaborate on, how the issue of GBV and the experiences of women and children in particular pose challenges more broadly for the region, both in terms of peace, prosperity, economic development, and why that's really, really important for those within the Western Hemisphere to not just acknowledge, but impactfully respond to.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Natalie, and I'm very happy and honored to share the panel with Jennifer, who does such an important work. Well, we heard a little bit in the previous panel about the complex costs of gender-based violence for a society, not only the direct costs in terms of lives that are lost or severely hurt, but also all the other costs that come along in terms of lost productivity, lost days of work, missed opportunities for small businesses to grow and bloom. So it is, and then the costs of attending victims and supporting them. There's also a financial cost that could have been avoided in a different scenario where we wouldn't be dealing with this big problem. Children have an additional important cost, which is that the trauma that is generated by these experiences is going to be with them for life and likely affecting them, their capacity to reach their potential as, healthy, productive citizens and individuals, because these are very extremely traumatic experiences at early years. So as a society, we are really putting a huge toll in terms of individuals' well-being and their capacity to flourish to the best of their potential through this big burden of living these incredibly traumatic experiences.
I think you bring up a really, really important point, too, in the fact that just globally, not just in terms of, the population booms within the hemisphere, but there are more young people alive today than at any point in human history. We, everywhere around the world, we're seeing huge youth booms, and you're seeing incredible patterns of migration that only continue to grow. So this is something that stakeholders, not just the countries impacted, but the United States and others really need to acknowledge and respond to. And I want to draw a little bit on your point, an excellent point in terms of trauma, and come back to you, Jennifer, in making the journey north for migrants, especially adolescents and young women who choose to leave. They assume a significant risk in doing so, and that the risk they face is a lesser risk for many who consider it, compared to what they face day to day back home. So could you elaborate on, what that risk looks like, what they face, and why it's really, really important to recognize and respond to in terms of immigration solutions?
Sure, and I think, too, just to kind of comment on your, reaction about the large number of youth, we're also looking at this with a different lens since about 2014, right? In terms of, the people who are feeling like they can't be safe in Central America, it's mostly women and children, right? It's kids on their own, it's women with their children. So kind of, percentage-wise, we're talking about very high numbers, right? So it's a significant demographic shift. And so thinking about that, we need to make sure that our systems are updated to this new demographic, right? It's not just single men in search of work anymore, right? Yet our systems are still responding to and treating this population as if it is single men just coming for work, and it's not, right? And so, we're talking about, these kids and, what is it that they need, because they can't stay, because it's not safe to go to school. It's not safe at home for a lot of them, right? The gender-based violence is inextricably tied to violence against children, right? It's all together. And so, what we need to do is really be thinking about what are the systems, how are we going to be receiving this population that looks different and has different needs? What's the expertise that we need, right? What are the kinds of questions we need to be asking? What are the physical, facilities that we use to receive people? What is it that they're going to need? And when is it appropriate to offer those services? There's different services and different needs at different stages of the journey, right? And so we need to make sure that we're responding to that and really asking questions and thinking about what sorts of international collaboration can happen to make it so that there's a more seamless system of protection for the kids and we don't have kids falling through gaps like we're seeing right now. And look, these kids, they know exactly what the dangers are, right? I mean, of the years of so many people having migrated and so many people having returned, it's not like people don't know. This is not a decision that anyone takes lightly. They don't wake up and say, hey, I'm going to go on an adventure today. I'm going to go to the beach, or maybe I'll just go to America, see what happens. People know how serious it is, and they know how dangerous it is, right? I mean, there's risk to life and limb literally on this journey, right? They know that. I remember once I interviewed an 11-year-old boy, and he said he came on his own and he didn't tell his mother because he said his mother, would absolutely not let him go. He was trying to protect his younger siblings, though. He was saying to me, well, I'm getting to the age where the gangs are going to start recruiting me, and it's not safe, and they're going to go after my mom, and they're going to go after my sisters. It's my responsibility to protect them. I knew my mother would not let me go because she knew how dangerous it was, right? And so you have this little child who's already very cognizant of how dangerous it is, making this decision because it was going to be worse for his family if he had stayed.
I think you bring up a really great point, too, on the importance of really understanding the intricacies of the situation. And part of the problem that persists is the lack of data, not just in terms of what the migrant's journey looks like, right? Like, we have the narrative, those who are brave enough to share their stories. You have, the rumors and whatnot that permeates back to those who, as you said, make the unbelievable choice to leave. But in terms of actual data, it is incredibly limited, and gender disaggregated data in particular. Based on what we do know, about 60 to 80% of women who do choose to leave the Northern Triangle or from elsewhere but make their way through the Northern Triangle on their journey north, face sexual violence. That's astounding. Absolutely astounding. And one of the things I so appreciate about IDB is the incredible appreciation and commitment to data and impact assessments. And so, Caridad, I was hoping that you could share a bit about why IDB has embraced so vigorously the importance of data and how you use these incredible evaluations and impact assessments to really double down on the work that's being done through the bank's investments.
Thanks for the question. Sure, we firmly believe that we cannot change what we do not understand and what we do not measure. So data is a starting point to set baselines of where we are and where we want to get at. Data allow us to truthfully understand if our projects and the interventions we're supporting are contributing to that target or whether we need to rethink them and redesign them. So they allow us to learn. They allow us to do more of what we're doing well. And that is the combination of data with, studies and evaluations on actual interventions. So from a policy perspective, data sheds light to policies, and that is why the bank has a big commitment on evidence-based policy informed by data. And yes, data is expensive to gather. Disaggregated data is expensive, and in many occasions, data on gender-based violence is difficult to collect for very good reasons, right? So there's specific protocols and that have to be followed, and even when they are followed, there might be concerns with underreporting precisely because people are afraid to share some of their data. So in spite of all of these efforts, it is also an area where we have to be very mindful and methodologically very careful to make sure that we are making the best interpretations of the available data. But it continues to be a challenge. It's an area where we are working at the bank, where we want to do more, where we can do more, where we need to add up our efforts with those of other partners so that all of us can know what is working and what is not. Many of the people who spoke before me use the word systems when referring to how to respond to gender-based violence. Systems are complex. If we want to know if systems are providing quality services, well, that is a lot more complicated than if we were just focused in one service, a health service, a cash transfer. No, a system is a sum of services that are articulated around an individual or a group of individuals with a very complex set of needs. So making sure that the information across those services and systems is interconnected so that we can really address the problem from a holistic perspective in a topic that by nature it requires comprehensive responses. I'm just trying to illustrate some of the challenges of data not only as a tool to inform policy, but also to actually manage services and make sure services are reaching the people they need to reach with the quality they need to deliver to be effective. So administrative records that are interlinked so that people can navigate at a low cost between different types of services, data that connect family members between one another. I mean, that is still far away from where we are right now, but it is what is necessary to reach a population with these characteristics.
You don't know what you don't know, and you can't adequately respond to a problem with solutions if you don't know the scope and scale of the problem. And you raise an incredible point, and I wanna dive in a bit further then and look at some of IDB's solutions and investments and impact. And so much of that is rooted in the idea that partnerships matter and that we need to create synergies across systems. We need to create engagement across partners and communities. So one, I was wondering if you could share a bit about why that is so critical to the IDB's response, especially on GBV, and really what can be done to enhance it as well, of which data and consistent evaluation being one part of that, as you've already described.
Sure, so I'll try to be brief. Why partnerships matter? Well, because resources, all of our resources are limited and needs are not. So it's a responsibility to make the best possible use of available resources, and that requires avoiding duplicated efforts and actually building on synergies. So coordination and partnerships are a necessary condition to work with that approach. What are some experiences, some solutions, or some initiatives that are ongoing? So through our lending, we've supported initiatives to, for example, strengthen the quality of services for victims of gender-based violence. Last year, and now I'm going to move out of the Northern Triangle, but for the first time, the bank approved a loan in Uruguay that was targeted or focused, or the main client was in Mujeres, the National Institute of Women, and this loan was strengthening the quality of the services that women receive there. Something that was very important, but also innovative about this project, that it had an important focus on the differentiated needs of certain groups of women, in particular migrant women, but also LBT women. And it had an important component that was especially focused on victims of human trafficking. So that was an interesting and a different type of investment that the bank was doing, with a very, maybe in an amount, in dollar amount, smaller than other big infrastructure projects, but in terms of impact, in terms of complexity to design and execute, and in terms of the population that it is gonna reach, really at the heart of the bank's mission of improving lives, and of those whose lives need the most improvement. So that was a very interesting opportunity, of which we will be learning, and we wanna do more of this type of investments. A second, which is something that kind of comes with COVID, has to do, a second initiative, and this one is focused in Central America. COVID forced some of these weak systems, because let's recognize that the systems serving victims of gender-based violence are not particularly strong, offering quality services, et cetera. They're understaffed, under-budgeted, and have many challenges. But suddenly, they had to shut down because of lockdowns and transfer to virtual platforms. And so IDB has been working in supporting these efforts in countries such as Honduras and El Salvador. And as we started working with these virtual platforms, we saw there was also an opportunity to offer services for women who were migrating. And that added an additional layer of coordination, because it had to involve the local consulados, so that migrants, so that they were aware on how to best serve their citizens in their track. So there is, this is still something at a smaller scale. It's a project called Sin Fronteras, where we are actually trying to design a system that is accessible virtually, so people can access it while on the move, but where women
can reach out for some basic assistance when they are confronting problems of violence, and this is migrant women specifically. So that's maybe one last closing reflection. This addressing gender-based violence is already complex, and it involves lots of coordination. Where we're talking about migrant women, there's an additional layer that has to do with these transnational actors and that need to get involved. So it is an additional layer of complexity to the problem where there's already lots of articulation and coordination required.
Again, what I love about the IDB's approach to this is there is both that balance of prevention and attention, but this emphasis on holistic engagement, which I know is so incredibly important to KIND as well, and really is the foundation of how KIND's programs are set up. And so, Jennifer, I was hoping you could build on some of the points that Caridad mentioned, in talking about KIND's approach in its holistic programming and its holistic engagement, particularly not just between the services it provides to those who end up here in the United States and are in need of things like legal services and other social services, but also the engagement that KIND has in terms of its partnership and in-country programming within the Northern Triangle.
Sure. It was interesting listening to, IDB's approach. I think KIND, is on a similar approach, much smaller, than the IDB, but similarly, as I said, right, we need to serve kids now, here, meet them where they are. Are they en route? Are they at the border? Are they living in our communities, going through the immigration court process? But if the ultimate goal is how do we make sure they can stay at home, what we've started to do is try to think of what programming in Central America is needed to start developing that so that kids can stay home. So, we've partnered with local organizations in Guatemala and Honduras and really ask them, you tell us, what do you think will work in your community? Every community is different, right? And one size does not fit all. And so what we've done is funded, through partnerships and try to help build capacity in the region with different kinds of programming. One community said to us, we want you to work with our teachers, right? They need to understand how to talk about gender-based violence. They need to know how to identify it. They need to know how to report it. They need to know. Another community said, what we really need is we need girls programming. So girls have somewhere to go. They can learn what gender-based violence is, and they need economic opportunities. Let them start small entrepreneurial projects, right? Those are very different, right? But that's what that community needed. And so again, it's meeting kids where they are, and how can we make sure that they have the tools and resources that they need to hopefully be able to stay eventually and not have to make that arduous journey.
Jennifer's incredibly humble, but I believe in KIND's existence. You have trained over 50,000, trainees in providing various levels of service. You've had 27,000 or over 27,000 kids referred, and you count over 700 partners among your network. So you may be small, but you're doing incredibly mighty work that is doing tremendous things for the most vulnerable members of society among us. So I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about some of the other actors who have a role, some of which may be better engaged than others. And so specifically thinking about the role of the United States, and I want to talk a little bit about Mexico too. I want to start with you, Jennifer. What do you think we are doing well in terms of addressing gender-based violence and its impact on regional migration? But I also want to come back to that and look at, where are there opportunities to improve, or where are there things we are not paying attention to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all these questions are spot on, right? And I referenced this before, right? There's been a huge demographic shift, right? So initially, the knee-jerk reaction as migration from Central America, grew, change was, well, we got to stop that, right? Let's deter it. Let's do everything we can to stop it, tell people not to come, try to make it impossible for them to come, right? You can't deter away a refugee situation, right? That does not work. We have seen year after year after year, administration after administration after administration really try to double down on this deterrence, right? It's not working, right? It doesn't change. All it does is it makes things more dangerous, right? It forces people underground. It forces children to try to swim across the Rio Grande, right? Instead of walking up to a bridge and asking an official for help, right? So we really need to think about, how do we get off of this deterrence model and really think about, regional cooperation, investing in root causes. I will say, there have been really great advances that we've seen recently where we've seen the U.S. say, okay, let's really talk seriously and make long-term investments into the region. And one of the 5 pillars that the Biden administration put out in terms of the root causes work was looking at how do you prevent gender-based violence, right? So we were very pleased to see that, right? They started the Gender Policy Council, right, to really have in the White House an entity that's looking across programming, how do you include a gender lens and gender protection, right, in that lens. We've seen announcements and investments and talk about preventing gender-based violence during the summit in Los Angeles just a few weeks ago. And so I think we're starting to slowly see this kind of progress. We're seeing Congress willing to fund programming, dedicate money to combating gender-based violence in the region. And so I think we're slowly starting to see a recognition and opening of this. I think what we need to do is really just continue to push against this deterrence-only model.
And there are some elements of low-hanging fruit, if you will, right? Like there are some real opportunities where the U.S. government can engage, some best practices that we know from looking at how children in more precarious situations have engagement with systems and how we make best interest determinations on their behalf. Are there any that come to mind that having an opportunity right now to kind of call out that you think are important to highlight?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing, KIND has been working on, because we have offices in Mexico and in the United States, is sometimes Mexico is a destination country, sometimes it's a transit country, right? But if you have an unaccompanied child there, Mexico has very strong child protection laws on the books, right? They require the Mexican government to do a best interest assessment. What we want them to do is take a look at that child and be very holistic and say, what is in that child's best interest? If mom lives in Chicago, is it really in that child's best interest to ask for asylum in Mexico, right? Is it better for everyone if that child really wants to be with mom at the end of the day? Why don't we just help facilitate the child's, asking for protection in the United States and going through the system where they have support, a system of support, and probably then not duplicating it, right? Do we really need that kid to go through the asylum system in Mexico, which is already backed up, and then later maybe ask for asylum in the United States, right? Let's really be holistic and think about how can these governments work together to identify what's in a child's best interest. Another idea that I think, is slowly gaining traction and we're hoping the Biden administration will implement is, thinking about who's receiving a child at an international border, right? Across the world, we see kids on their own migrating, and there's different practices around the world in terms of reception. Oftentimes it's law enforcement first, right? But having a law enforcement officer who's wearing a uniform and a badge and carrying a gun, receiving a kid and say, are you scared? Not a best practice, right? I mean, we want someone who knows how to do trauma-informed interviewing, someone whose job they want to be caring and interacting with children, right? Not someone who took a job to, conduct law enforcement or do night raids and night vision goggles all night, but they really know how to do child protection and they want to do it and they understand trauma-informed interviewing. These are the kinds of people countries should be hiring as part of their border reception and shelter reception. Congress appropriated money for Customs and Border Protection in the United States to do that. So we're hoping now that this administration will start hiring these kinds of professionals. Same in Mexico. We're hoping that the child protection authorities have more interaction with the migration enforcement officials so that those professionals are the ones interacting with kids who are on the move.
I want to pull up now to some of the other stakeholders in the region, and thank you, Jennifer, for mentioning Mexico. But Caridad, from your perspective especially, what do you see as the key reasons why international stakeholders need to pay attention to what is happening, not just in terms of gender-based violence within the Northern Triangle, but we know that this is a silent pandemic across the Western Hemisphere?
Yes, I mean, I think I want to go back to my first point, which is the point of trauma, and after I answer my question, I was left a little worried that, and I'm going to answer this question.
That's okay. It was a
but
perfect
I want to clarify that the reason why I emphasize this on kids is because they have their whole lives ahead of them. It's not that, that violence is not living trauma in women, but with kids, we're talking about many, many years of life ahead where they're carrying this heavy burden with them. And I think that is the reason why the international community should care about this, because it is whatever, I mean, not only this problem can continue for many years, but the costs of it, of whatever has already happened, will be with individuals and their lives and their productivity and their well-being for many, many years. And many of these individuals are children who have their whole lives ahead of them. So we definitely want to deal with this problem in a way that ensures the well-being of all of these lives that are a ton of potential put at risk because of very, very tragic circumstances.
It's a really important point because there is a significant need for compassion, and we all have a moral obligation to protect the most vulnerable among our society, let alone the fact that the trauma that these kids and women within these communities experience has a direct knock-on effect in terms of GDP and productivity and all the things you mentioned at the start. Are there ways international stakeholders can better engage, or are there things that you hope to see progress or change a bit in terms of those who have capacity to other institutions that have capacity to invest and to help strengthen systems or build capacity?
I mean, I think there is always potential for all of us to do more and better partnerships, to coordinate better, to communicate better, and definitely, one of the key pillars of the IDB's work is gender equality, and more broadly, and indeed the focus on preventing gender-based violence and protecting victims as part of that bigger umbrella. So definitely we're committed to working with more partners and doing more and learning from what others have done, learning from our own successes and mistakes and failures, and to definitely push this agenda and do more. And there's other things that are happening on the ground, and that if I have a couple more minutes, I'd like to share. For example, the IDB has supported over the years in Honduras and El Salvador a model called Ciudad Mujer, Women's City, which is a one-stop shop for women that are victims of violence, where they can receive a range of services, legal, health services, economic support, etc. So, and where they can feel welcome and safe and supported. So that is a wealth of expertise from which we and other partners can also learn as to what can be done better, more to bring this type of initiatives to a larger scale. What adjustments need to happen for them to be accessible to more women, or to women in areas that are less densely populated, to women who are on the move, etc. Another initiative that is actually very important and probably very linked to your work is work in El Salvador. The IDB has supporting with children who are raised, especially very young children who are being raised by their grandparents because their parents have moved. So this is skip generation households. And really thinking of the well-being and the development, to what extent the developmental needs of these children are being met by their grandparents who have had to take over the task of raising these very young children. And so there too, I think there is a wealth of knowledge that can translate into important investments, and probably if we add partners, the end product is going to be more than the sum of our individual efforts, I think, to have impactful responses for these very, very vulnerable populations.
The examples you bring up, I think, reiterate your earlier point as well in terms of the importance of data and evaluation and assessment. And we don't have to essentially reinvent the wheel. We don't exclusively have to come up with new solutions and always be innovative. And to Jennifer's point as well, there are things we know work in other contexts. And obviously we need to be incredibly thoughtful in terms of the history and culture of different communities. But there are examples that exist that have had impact, that can be replicated with the right adjustments, which can have tremendous impact in moving forward progress and creating a safer day today for women and children in these countries and across the region. So, you have described the incredible work that your respective organizations are doing, albeit in different capacities and with different approaches. But for those who are watching and who are curious how they can engage, whether they're policymakers, whether they're philanthropic foundations, whether they're, the media, those who have an interest in being part of the very necessary coalition that is needed to continue to move progress forward on these issues. What is your call to action? Where can people join and support the great work that you're doing? Jennifer, do you want to start?
Sure. There's 1,000,001 ways. Everything from, we rely on volunteers to take kids' cases, right? People are taking kids' cases for free to help them go through immigration court. We need people to really sensitize this idea of child rights and child protection, right? I think sometimes some of these issues get mired in politics, right? And what we need to do is lift it out. Child protection is not a political issue, right? It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you sit on, right? People care about child protection, and how do you elevate that and take it out of some of kind of the toxic conversation that sometimes we find ourselves in and really recenter ourselves again. So there's individual casework and support and volunteers in our offices, around the world. There's, our policy positions. We have take actions on our website for our supporters who are able to do taking their own action. We have, policy papers out there on what, legislative, administratively, and internationally should be done to increase child protection. And we always welcome engagement. We're always happy to talk and engage and come up with ideas and brainstorm. And again, listen to our colleagues, who also have good ideas, right? This is going to take an entire village, right? It's not, one entity alone that can do it. And so really finding as many partners as we can on this to really move the needle on some of these tough issues.
Carrie Dodd?
Well, for individuals, I would invite them to visit the bank's websites where there's lots of resources, knowledge, data that can inform and motivate their actions, and definitely volunteer and contribute to the very important initiatives from organizations that rely on individual volunteer work like the ones Jennifer is describing. For organizations at the country level, we're always happy to engage through our country offices to identify opportunities for collaboration and dialogue. At a more regional level, of course, here too, thinking about, there's several ongoing conversations on bigger regional initiatives around an agenda with multiple components on gender equality in the region, diversity, inclusion. So our doors are always open. We're always happy to engage and listen what we can do more of, what we can do better, and how we can join forces with others who share the same objectives.
Fantastic. Well, before I close out, I always like to ask folks, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you think is incredibly important? I know, Caridad, you wanted to elaborate a little bit more on your point on trauma, but we've covered a lot of ground, but I want to make sure because this is such an important topic. Any closing words?
I mean, the one last thing I would say, I talked about kind of getting input. One thing KIND takes very seriously and is really trying to build more up of is really taking the expertise of kids and youth who have lived experience, right? So it's one thing for those of us sitting in Washington to come up and think we have good ideas, and another to talk to somebody who's actually, had the experience themselves. And so how can we make sure that we're really centering our work and really learning from the expertise? And so really trying to build up those opportunities so we can grow those systems and grow that cachet of, technical expertise to inform all of our work.
So often those who are most impacted by policies are not present or included within the process of those policies creation. And that's really to the detriment of getting to progress. Caridad, any closing remarks?
Just to recognize that there's still big knowledge gaps on how we can, what are the most effective ways of preventing gender-based violence, because we really would want to focus on prevention. And also important knowledge gaps on what are the most cost-effective models that can serve victims and offer them quality. And I think we still need to learn. It is an area where we still need to learn. And our countries face important fiscal constraints. So that makes the responsibility of identifying the most cost-effective interventions that can be scaled up to reach this very large population that needs these services, even so more important. So I wanted to emphasize the fact that we still need to learn a lot about this.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to wind down this conversation. I know we all have so much more to say, but the thing I want to emphasize is that, as we heard from the first panel, as we heard from the second panel as well, a country cannot succeed when half its population is left out. A country will not succeed when its next generation is undervalued, unprotected, and abused. And we really stand at a crossroads in terms of an opportunity to correct course, or an increasing challenge that will have wide-reaching impact, not just in terms of what's going on in the Northern Triangle, but in terms of broader peace, prosperity, and stability across the region. And in seeking to secure a brighter future across the hemisphere, immigration and development policies really must include solutions to address gender inequity and gender-based violence. And as continuous circumstances at the U.S. southern border demonstrate, security and growth really is not possible without them. So with that, I want to thank the panelists who joined me on panel 2. I want to thank Jenny and our panelists who led the conversation earlier. I especially want to express our gratitude to the Wilson Center, who have been an absolute tremendous partner. And I know Beatrice, at the start of this discussion, emphasized her keenness and the Wilson Center's keenness to continue our collaboration, which I definitely think is something that we are eager to do as well. And with that, I want to encourage all those who are tuning in to check out the incredible resource the Wilson Center has put together, Pathways to Justice, which includes essays and longer form products looking at the issue of gender-based violence, not just in terms of what's happening in the Northern Triangle and across the Western Hemisphere, but really insightful reports in terms of what this looks like worldwide. And within that resource, it includes our Bush Institute authored report, No Justice, Gender-Based Violence, and Migration in Central America. So thank you to everyone who's tuned in, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.